Hello everybody, I'm Carl. Thank you for coming by. Today's story is The Night Harbor. It's a modern day fantasy about Dave Mitchell, a folklore professor grappling with writer's block in the middle of a career crisis. To get a change of pace and environment, he's taking a sabbatical in Hamburg, Germany, and one day, hoping for inspiration, he finds himself in the pre-dawn hours at the Hamburg fish market, where merchants have been trading goods since 1703. David comes across a mysterious coffee vendor who brews more than coffee and opens David's eyes to a whole new world. The Night Harbor is a tale of magical realism that explores the differences between analyzing stories and truly experiencing them. It's set against the atmospheric backdrop of Hamburg's waterfront and weaves together the themes of academic burnout, family legacy, and the magic that lives in the spaces between tellings. Please hit the like button if you enjoyed the story. If you want to see more, hit subscribe. And above all, I am still relatively new to writing, and I would appreciate any comments, good or bad. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the story.
Dave Mitchell stared at the blinking cursor on his laptop screen, watching it pulse like a mechanical heartbeat against the white emptiness of the document. Outside his small St. Pauli flat, Hamburg's December darkness pressed against the windows. His phone's screen told him it was already 4 a.m. The cursor blinked again, mocking him with its steady rhythm. 67 days in Germany, and he hadn't written a single worthwhile word. His coffee had gone cold again, third cup since midnight, and still no words. Back in Boston, he'd taught his students about writer's block with compassion. It's not about being stuck, he'd say. It's about finding your way back to the story. Those words held a different weight now, sitting alone in Hamburg, trying to find his own way back. The document's header still read, "Modern applications of traditional narrative structures in." The rest remained blank, like everything else he'd tried to write since the incident. His department chair's words echoed in his head, a complete breakdown of academic professionalism, concerns about mental fitness. Taking a leave of absence might be best. Dave closed the laptop harder than necessary. On his bookshelf, well-worn copies of folklore, collections, and mythological studies stood in silent judgment. Books he'd once loved, stories he'd once brought to life for eager undergraduates. Now they were just reminders of another life, another David James Mitchell who hadn't lost his way. His phone buzzed. Another email from the department secretary about paperwork for his sabbatical. He ignored it, like he'd ignored the last 6. Let them think he was finding himself in Europe, having some eat, pray, love moment of spiritual awakening. Better than admitting he was hiding in a 6th-floor walk-up, watching his savings dwindle while he failed to write. The flat was small even by European standards, a converted attic space with slanting ceilings and windows that looked out over Hamburg's sprawling port. He'd chosen it precisely for that view, though he couldn't have explained why. Something about the constant movement of ships, the ebb and flow of commerce and humanity spoke to him in ways he couldn't articulate. His grandmother's inheritance had made this escape possible, just enough for a year abroad if he was careful. "Find your stories again," she'd written in her last letter, as if she'd known he would need an escape hatch. She'd been the one to tell him about Hamburg in the first place, her stories of the port city sparking his first interest in how tales traveled across oceans and cultures. Dave pulled on his heavy coat and grabbed his notebook, empty like all the others he'd bought since arriving. The stairs creaked under his feet as he descended, each step an accusation. Failure, failure, failure. Outside, the city was caught in that strange hour between night and dawn. The last drunk revelers still stumbled from the Reeperbahn's endless bars, while early shift workers hurried past with coffee cups clutched like talismans against the cold. The air smelled of salt water and possibilities, though That last part might have been his writer's imagination, or what was left of it. He walked without destination, letting muscle memory guide him through streets that had become familiar over the past 2 months. His German was still terrible, but he'd learned enough to navigate the basics. Ein Kaffee bitte and Entschuldigung, covering most of his daily interactions. The harbor drew him like a magnet, as it did most mornings. Something about the water helped, even if it didn't unlock whatever had frozen inside him. The massive cranes stood like sleeping giants against the pre-dawn sky, their lights blinking red in steady rhythm. A different kind of cursor, marking time in the darkness. His phone buzzed again. Mom this time probably checking if he'd found himself yet. Her voice message yesterday had been a masterpiece of passive-aggressive concern. We just worry, David. Jordan Harrison's daughter is doing so well at Yale Law. He let it go to voicemail. The incident played through his mind again, unbidden. One moment he'd been lecturing on comparative mythology, drawing parallels between ancient hero quests and modern narratives. The next, well, the video had gone viral in certain academic circles. The rising star of folklore studies having a complete breakdown mid-lecture, ranting about the death of authentic storytelling in the digital age. He'd used words like cultural strip mining and commodification of wonder. The students had looked terrified. He'd walked out mid-lecture, leaving his notes scattered across the podium. By sunset, the faculty message boards were buzzing. By midnight, the video had made its way to academic Twitter. By morning, the department chair was waiting in his office with that carefully neutral expression. Administrators, perfect over years of handling faculty crises. The harbor carried the sharp bite of the deck member air. Tourist season had ended months ago, leaving the waterfront to those who actually worked here: sailors, dock workers, fish merchants, and the occasional insomniac professor pretending to be a writer. The massive Christmas market in the city center drew most visitors away from the water, leaving these early morning hours to the real Hamburg. He checked his phone. 4:47 a.m. The fish market would be officially starting at 5. The famous Hamburg Fish Market had run every Sunday since 1703, though nowadays it was as much tourist attraction as actual market. But at this hour, before the tour buses arrived, it still held echoes of its original purpose. Real traders still came here, conducting business the way their great-grandparents had. The market hall itself, the Fischauctionshalle, loomed ahead, a red brick cathedral to commerce built in 1894. During summer weekends, it transformed into an early morning dance hall after the clubs closed, but this December it stood quiet, waiting for the day's business to begin. Dave remembered reading that Hamburg's position on the Elbe River had made it a crucial point for story transmission across Europe. Tales traveled with trade, shifting and changing, like cargo being transferred from ship to ship. His grandmother used to tell him that every story in Europe had passed through Hamburg's harbor at some point, picking up local color before moving on. Stories are like cats, she'd say, in that precise Boston accent that seemed to sharpen with age. They go where they please, but they always know where the fish are. He hadn't understood what she meant then. He still didn't. The first vendors were setting up their stalls, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this thousands of times before. The air filled with German, Turkish, Polish, a dozen languages, competing with the sound of crates being unstacked and tables being arranged. Dave found himself a spot against one of the market hall's outer walls, just watching. He'd started bringing his notebook to these early morning wanderings, though he never wrote anything. Sometimes he'd open it, pen poised, waiting for inspiration that never came. The blank pages seemed to multiply every time he looked away. His academic work had once focused on how stories adapted to new contexts, how they survived by changing. Narratives are living things, he'd written in his first published paper, evolving to survive in new cultural ecosystems. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years studying how stories changed and survived, only to find himself unable to tell any stories at all. The market was coming alive around him now. Fishmongers arranged their displays with artistic precision, each fish placed just so, ice carefully distributed to catch the light. The first coffee vendors were firing up their machines, sending steam into the cold air. Somewhere, someone was testing a microphone, the feedback echoing off the old brick walls. That's when he noticed the other cart, the one that hadn't been there a moment ago. Or had it? His memory felt suddenly uncertain, like trying to recall a dream while still half asleep. The cart stood in a pool of warm light that seemed to push back against the pre-dawn darkness, and music, Bob Marley, he thought, drifted from an ancient boombox, perched precariously on one corner. The cart's owner moved with the music, his dreads swaying as he arranged cups and adjusted dials on what looked like a cross between an espresso machine and something from a Victorian science museum. Copper pipes twisted counterintuitive around glass chambers, and steam escaped in rhythmic puffs that somehow matched the music's beat. Ah, another sleepless wanderer. The man's voice carried a thick Jamaican accent and more genuine warmth than Dave had heard in months. Come, come, the morning is too cold for standing in shadows. Dave found himself moving forward before he'd made a conscious decision to do so. The cart itself was a converted roll-top desk, its surface covered in years of collected decorations. Ribbons, beads, concert pins, and patches from what looked like sailors' uniforms. Everything about it should have seemed cluttered or chaotic. But somehow it all worked together, like a story told in objects rather than words. Marcus knows just what you need, the vendor said, already working at his strange machine. No, not the regular blend. Your eyes say something special is required. He looked up, fixing Dave with a gaze that seemed to see straight through his carefully maintained facade of being fine. Professor, yes, but not teaching now, running from stories that won't come. Dave stepped back, startled. How did you... The shoulders, they always carry the weight of unwritten books. Marcus laughed, the sound somehow harmonizing with the music. And these days, you carry many unwritten books, Professor Mitchell. I didn't tell you my name. Didn't you? Marcus winked, his hands never stopping their dance over the coffee machine's controls. Memory plays tricks in the early morning. Like stories, it comes and goes as it pleases. The smell coming from the machine was unlike any coffee Dave had encountered. Notes of cardamom and star anise, something deeper that reminded him of old books and sea air. And underneath it all, something he couldn't quite identify, but that made him think of his grandmother's study, where she told him stories of Hamburg's harbor. This is my special blend, Marcus said, pouring the dark liquid into a cup that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the cart's warm light. Best drunk in the shadows, where the old walls keep their secrets. Some say it helps lost things find their way home. Dave took the cup, noticing how the steam rose in perfect spirals. How much do I... Stories are the only currency I need, Marcus interrupted, already turning to adjust his ancient boombox. And you, Professor Mitchell, are full of untold ones. Drink, the market is waiting. Dave retreated to his spot against the wall, cup warming his hands. The coffee's scent grew stronger, more complex. He took a sip and felt warmth spread from his center, chasing away more than just the December cold. The market's sound seemed to shift, deepening, taking on harmonies he hadn't noticed before. He blinked and for a moment thought he saw something impossible. Ships that couldn't exist anchored at the harbor's edge, their sails made of shadow and starlight. He blinked again, and the vision remained. Marcus's voice drifted over, though when Dave looked, the vendor seemed occupied with other customers. "Welcome to the night harbor, Professor. Mind your step. The boundaries between worlds are thin here, and some stories have teeth." Dave's first step toward the harbor felt different, as if the cobblestones beneath his feet had softened. The air thickened with possibility, heavy with the scent of foreign spices and distant seas. Marcus's coffee warmed his hands, each sip making the ships at the water's edge more distinct, more real. The regular fishing boats were still there, but between them, Dave blinked hard, his academic mind struggling to catalog what he saw. A Viking longship, its dragon-head prow breathing actual steam into the winter air. Next to it, a Chinese junk with sails that rippled like silk in a wind that didn't exist. Further along, a Greek trireme floated high atop the water, its bronze ram gleaming with otherworldly light. The dock itself had changed. The familiar concrete and steel had given way to ancient wooden planks that seemed to absorb the sound of his footsteps. The planks extended far beyond where the real harbor should end, disappearing into a fog that glowed with its own inner light. Lanterns floated at irregular intervals, their flames burning in mystical colors. As he walked closer to the ships, he noticed the people, if they could all be called that. A tall woman in Viking furs argued with what appeared to be a Japanese kappa, water constantly rippling in the bowl-shaped hollow of its green-scaled head. A group of what had to be selkies huddled near the water's edge, their magical sealskins draped over human shoulders like precious cloaks. A man with goat legs, a faun from the old stories, hurried past carrying a stack of books that whispered to each other. "First time in the night harbor?" The voice came from his left, where a small stall had appeared between one breath and the next. The vendor was an elderly Chinese woman who might have been 60 or 600. Everyone remembers their first time, the way the world opens up, yes, like waking from a dream into a better dream. Dave found himself drawn to her stall. Bottles of every size and shape lined the shelves, each containing what looked like swirling clouds of color. "What are they?" he heard himself ask. "Stories, of course. Some lost, some forgotten, some not yet told." She lifted one bottle where crimson and gold clouds twisted around each other. "This one? A love story from the Tang Dynasty. Never written down, but too beautiful to die. That one there," she pointed to a bottle of midnight blue, "is the last dream of a whale who sang alone for 20 years, and this," she held up a clear bottle that seemed empty until it caught the light. "This is your story, Professor, the one you're afraid to tell." Dave stepped back, nearly spilling his coffee. "How did you—" "The same way Marcus knew. We all know a story seeker when we see one." She smiled, revealing teeth that might have been pearl or moonlight. "But you're not ready for these yet. The night harbor reveals what you need when you need it. Best to explore a bit first. Yes? Find your sea legs." She gestured toward the longest dock, where the strangest ships were moored. "Follow the lanterns. They'll show you where you need to go. But mind the gaps between the planks. The water here runs deep, and some of what swims below remembers older, hungrier times." Dave looked down at the dark water between the dock's planks. For a moment, he thought he saw movement in the depths, something vast and ancient stirring. He clutched his coffee cup tighter and started walking toward the ships, careful to step where the floating lanterns cast their otherworldly light. The first ship Dave approached was the Viking longship. Its dragon-head prow turned to watch him pass, eyes gleaming with actual flame. On its deck, a woman with silver white hair and crow feather cloak arranged runes that skittered across her table like nervous mice. Seeking stories, are you? Her voice carried the chill of Norse winters. We have sagas here that would crack your modern skull open. Tales of gods and giants that haven't been heard since the old tongues died. She held up a runestone that hummed with blue light. But perhaps you're not ready for such weighty tales. Dave moved on, drawn to the Chinese junk where paper lanterns floated without strings. An elderly man in elaborate robe sat cross-legged on a silk cushion that hovered above the deck. Before him, scrolls unrolled themselves in midair, characters swimming across the paper like schools of fish. Ah, a teacher who can no longer teach, the man said without opening his eyes. A storyteller who has lost his stories. We have many such visitors. He gestured, and a scroll floated closer to Dave. These are tales that escaped the burning of the Imperial Library, stories that survived by hiding in dreams and whispers. The scroll's characters rearranged themselves into English before Dave's eyes, but as he reached for it, the old man raised a warning hand. These words bite, Professor. Are you sure your fingers can handle their teeth? Each ship seemed to house its own strange and magical marketplace. On the Greek trireme, 3 women shared a single eye between them, passing it back and forth as they wove tapestries from thread of starlight. The patterns showed stories unfolding, heroes and monsters, triumphs and tragedies, all shifting and changing as he watched. You could be in this one, the sister with the eye said, her fingers never stopping their work. Every story needs new blood sometimes. Fresh perspectives, added the second sister, reaching for the eye. New endings, concluded the third, her blind face turned toward Dave with unsettling accuracy. The deeper into the harbor he walked, the stranger the vessels became. A Spanish galleon made entirely of books, its sails pages of forbidden texts. A Polynesian outrigger that seemed to float on moonlight rather than water. Its navigator, a woman with tattoos that moved across her skin like living things. Between the ships, smaller vendors had set up stalls on floating platforms. A young girl sold bottles of distilled déjà vu. A man with fox eyes offered memories of places that never existed. A creature that seemed made entirely of shadows traded in slightly used happy endings. Dave's coffee had long since gone cold, but he couldn't bring himself to let go of the cup. It felt like his only anchor to the real world, though even that certainty was beginning to fade. How long had he been walking? The fog made time feel slippery, unreliable. The next ship struck him silent, a massive Arabian dhow, its wooden sides carved with stories that moved and changed as he watched. On its deck, a man sat surrounded by thousands of floating lights, each one containing what looked like a miniature scene. These are the stories that got away, he said, gesturing to the lights, the ones that slipped through cracks in reality or died halfway through telling or got lost in translation. He caught one of the lights and held it out. Inside, Dave saw a familiar scene, himself standing at a lecture podium, but this version wasn't falling apart. This version was finishing the lecture, the students leaning forward, engaged and inspired. What might have been, the man said softly, but that's not what you're really looking for, is it? Dave shook his head, though he wasn't sure why. The light floated back to join its companions. No, I thought not. You're looking for something more fundamental. He stood, his robe shimmering with embedded stories. Come aboard, Professor Mitchell. I believe I have what you seek. The gangplank adjusted its angle as Dave approached, almost eager. Each step onto the ship's deck felt like walking into a library, a temple, and a dream all at once. The wood beneath his feet was warm, alive with the pulse of countless narratives. The man led him to the stern, where a circular space had been arranged with cushions that seemed woven from twilight. Above them, the stars were wrong, constellations he'd never seen telling stories he couldn't quite grasp. Your grandmother, the man said, settling onto one of the cushions. She understood about stories, about their weight, their hunger. That's why she sent you here. She didn't send me. Dave started to protest, but stopped. Had there been something in that last letter, some hint in her stories about Hamburg that he'd missed? Not directly, no. The man's smile was kind but knowing. But she knew what lived in these waters, what waited for those who've lost their way. He reached into the air and plucked another light, this one pulsing with a familiar warmth. Look. Inside the sphere, Dave saw his grandmother's study, saw himself at 7, curled in her oversized armchair while she told stories of ships and sailors, of harbors where magic still lived if you knew where to look. He watched his younger self lean forward, eyes wide, drinking in every word. You didn't lose your stories, Professor Mitchell. You buried them, wrapped them in academic papers and theoretical frameworks until they couldn't breathe. His voice was gentle but firm. Stories aren't meant to be dissected. They're meant to be fed. Fed? Stories are living things. They hunger, they grow, they change. He gestured at the lights around them. These aren't just tales. They're possibilities. Each one a path not taken, a word not spoken, a dream not quite remembered upon waking. He stood moving to a small cabinet inlaid with mother of pearl that shifted like oil on water. I can give you back what you've lost, help you remember how to feed your stories, how to let them breathe. He opened the cabinet, removing something that glowed like a coal in his hands. But there's a price. There always is in stories like this, Dave said, his academic knowledge surfacing. The pearl of great price, the forbidden fruit, the devil's bargain. Good, you haven't forgotten everything. He opened his hands. In his palms lay what looked like an old fountain pen, its barrel made of dark wood that seemed to absorb light. This belonged to your grandmother. Dave stared at it. That's impossible. Her pen was buried with her. Was it? The man's smile deepened. Or was that just another story? The pen called to him. His fingers itched to hold it, to feel its weight. What's the price? You'll have to give up analyzing stories. No more papers on narrative structure. No more lectures on comparative mythology. His eyes held Dave's. You'll have to become part of the stories instead. Let them use you as much as you use them. That's my whole career, my life's work. No, your life's work was sharing stories, making them live. Remember? He held out the pen. You can have this life back, the tenure, the publications, the academic respect, or you can have the stories themselves, not to study, to live, to breathe, to feed. Dave stared at the pen, remembering his grandmother's voice. Stories are like cats, they go where they please. He understood now. She hadn't been talking about stories moving through trade routes or cultural transmission. She'd been talking about something more fundamental, more alive. If I take it, he asked, his voice barely a whisper, then you join us. Become part of the Night Harbor's story, a keeper of tales rather than a scholar of them. He gestured at the floating lights around them. These stories need tending, feeding, sharing. They need someone who remembers how to make them dance. Dave thought about his empty flat, the blank documents, the unwritten papers, thought about his students' faces when he used to bring old tales to life, before he started dissecting them instead. Thought about his grandmother's study, warm with stories and possibility. And if I don't? Then you wake up by the fish market, convinced this was all a dream, born of too much coffee and too little sleep. You'll write your papers, maybe even get tenure somewhere. You'll teach students about narrative structures and cultural paradigms, and you'll never quite remember why, That feels hollow. The pen hummed in his open palm, calling to Dave. The woods seemed to ripple like water in moonlight. His grandmother's initials appeared and faded along its length, written in script that moved like living things. Dave reached for it, hesitated. Will I still be me? You'll be more you than you've been in years. His smile held secrets of its own. The stories have been waiting for you, Professor Mitchell. They're patient, but not endless. The deck beneath his feet thrummed with possibility. From the harbor came the sound of 1,000 tales waiting to be told, each one alive and hungry and real. He thought about his academic career, his publications, his carefully constructed theories about narrative transmission. Then he thought about his grandmother's voice, about the way stories used to feel before he learned to take them apart, about the magic that had lived in words before he'd learned to cage them in footnotes. Dave Mitchell took the pen. The world shifted, realigned. The stories rushed in like a tide, no longer content to be observed from a safe academic distance. They filled him, used him, transformed him. He was the boy in his grandmother's study and the professor in his lecture hall, and something else entirely, something that lived in the spaces between tellings. Welcome home, the man said, but his voice had changed, carrying echoes of every storyteller who had ever sat by firelight, and began with Once Upon a Time. The night harbor spread before him, no longer foreign or frightening. He could see the patterns now, the way tales wove between the ships like currents, the way each vendor tended their particular streams of story. This was what his grandmother had tried to tell him about, what he'd spent years studying but never understanding. Dawn was approaching in the real Hamburg. He could feel it. Soon the regular fish market would be full of tourists and vendors selling mundane wares. But now he knew what lived beneath that surface, what swam in the depths between tellings. The early crowd will be coming soon, he said, surprising himself with the certainty of it. They'll be hungry for stories. They always are. The man gestured toward Marcus's cart, visible through the harbor mist. That's why we're here. Dave nodded, feeling the weight of the pen in his hand, the weight of all the stories it could tell. His academic papers seemed distant now, irrelevant. There were better ways to keep stories alive than pinning them to pages like dead butterflies. He found his spot near Marcus's cart just as the first real customers began arriving at the fish market. The pen was warm in his hand, ready. The stories moved through him now, living things seeking voice and form. A young girl approached the cart, eyes wide with wonder that only she could see the impossible ships in the harbor behind him. He smiled, remembering his own first glimpse of the night harbor. Would you like to hear a story? He asked. I know quite a few. The sun rose over Hamburg's harbor, and David James Mitchell began to tell tales that weren't meant to be studied, only shared. Behind him, in waters that existed somewhere between reality and dream, the ships of the night harbor continued their endless trade in wonders. He was home.
Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to my story. I hope you enjoyed it very much. Please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting, and I hope I catch you here next time.